Hello, students of the Gospel of John. In this lecture, we will continue our discussion of introductory matters. In the last lecture, we spent all of our time on a major issue, and that is who exactly is the author of the fourth Gospel. And in that lecture, we saw that there is a claim within the Gospel itself that it was authored by the beloved disciple, whoever that was. And so we spent most of our time in last lecture talking about the identity of the beloved disciple. So I want to recap those possibilities right quickly. We saw the traditional view, which has persisted for most of church history, is that the beloved disciple is John the Apostle. Also a view that is rarely held, but occasionally, and that is that the beloved disciple is Lazarus. In this century, last century and this century, there have been some scholars who have argued that John the beloved disciple is not John the Apostle, but another John, who was a disciple of Jesus, although not an apostle, his name being John the Presbyter or John the Elder. And then finally, we saw that there is at least some support for the notion that the beloved disciple is a disciple that we don't know otherwise, a disciple who lived there in the city of Jerusalem, not one of the apostles. So those are the possibilities that we looked at, and only God knows for sure what the answer is. Now, regardless of which four of these, and these are the leading contenders, which four of these is the beloved disciple, they all have something in common. All four of these people would have known Jesus directly and would have witnessed at least portions of his life. And the Gospel of John certainly does make a claim to be based on eyewitness testimony, as we will see a little bit later. Now then, let's talk about another issue that is related to the question of authorship. And that is, I want us to look at some evidence that suggests pretty strongly that the Gospel of John underwent certain stages of composition before it reached the form that we know it in today. So we're going to be looking at the evidence for such stages of composition. Now, when I talk about stages of composition, I am not suggesting or implying that there were earlier editions of the Gospel of John that circulated publicly among Christians and among the churches. Because the editorial processes that we're going to look at evidence of could have occurred prior to the publication of the gospel. We certainly don't have any ancient Greek manuscripts that differ from the Gospel of John, which we know. So that certainly suggests that other versions of the Gospel of John did not widely circulate. Otherwise, presumably, there would be some evidence of that. Now, some of the editorial revisions that we're going to talk about might have been performed by the beloved disciple himself, or perhaps some or even all of them were made by a close associate or close associates, perhaps even after the death of the beloved disciple. So now then, let's talk about the evidence of the stages of composition in the Gospel of John. First of all, I want you to turn to John chapter 21, verse 24. Here we have that famous statement that we looked at earlier. Jesus has been having a conversation with Peter and the beloved disciple, and Jesus has been talking about the beloved disciple, and in verse 24 we read the following. This is the disciple, that is the beloved disciple, who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Now, what's interesting here, of course, is the contrast between we know that his testimony is true. The whoever is speaking in the first person plural, the we, is clearly different from the beloved disciple. We know, they don't say we know that our testimony is true. They say we know that his testimony is true. So apparently that verse, at the very least, was written by someone else, attesting the authorship of this gospel and attesting the truthfulness of its testimony. Also, if you look at the verse right after this, verse 25, it reads as follows. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. Now that is a very interesting verse, because whoever wrote that verse speaks in first person singular. I suppose. That, of course, is in clear contrast to the we in the previous verse. And nowhere else in this gospel does anyone speak in first person, like this verse here, verse 25. So this verse also seems to have been written by someone else, not the beloved disciple. And apparently there is some reason for the change between the we of the previous verse and the I in this verse. Now, if you will turn back to the very last part of John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, I'll read them for you, but you need to take a look at them. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Sounds like a wonderful conclusion to the Gospel of John. After this verse, you're sort of surprised that there's anything that follows. So that makes a lot of folks think that verses 30 and 31 of chapter 20 was originally the conclusion to this gospel. And then at some point, chapter 21 was added to it as a kind of epilogue. That's a fairly common view among scholars. Certainly does sound like a wonderful conclusion to the gospel. Now, the next thing I want us to do is take a look at John chapter 14, verse 31. John chapter 14, verse 31. A lot of people through the centuries have noticed a strange phenomenon here. This is in the middle of Jesus's farewell discourse to the disciples on the night before he was crucified. And he's been talking to them for quite a while. And in verse 31, right at the very end, Jesus, speaking to his disciples, says, "Come now, let us leave." But then nothing is said about leaving. Jesus continues his discourse, chapter 15, chapter 16, chapter 17, there is a prayer of Jesus, and then go to chapter 18, verse 1. When he had finished praying, that is Jesus, Jesus left with his disciples. That is, he left the area in Jerusalem where he was and crossed the Kidron Valley. So this is really strange that you would have a statement so much earlier where Jesus says, "Come, let us go." And then there's all this talk of Jesus before finally this statement in chapter 18, verse 1. So that is the kind of thing that sometimes results when editing takes place. If you've edited a paper of your own, you know that once you go into a paper and you make some changes, you rearrange things, sometimes inadvertently you're left with something that's problematic because you've gone in and changed it and edited. This happens to me quite often. Another interesting passage is chapter 16, verse 5. Chapter 16, verse 5, Jesus is in the middle of speaking to his disciples in the farewell discourse, and he makes this remarkable statement in verse 5. He says, "None of you," that is, none of you disciples, "ask me, 'Where are you going?' Rather, you are filled with grief because I have said these things." Now, that's a very peculiar statement because if you look back at two previous verses in the farewell discourse, chapter 13, verse 36, and chapter 14, verse 5, the disciples, or a disciple, does ask Jesus, "Where are you going?" And yet in 16:5, Jesus makes this statement, "None of you ask where I'm going." Again, seems to be evidence of some editorial activity that has left chapter 16, verse 5 sounding odd because there are a couple of passages earlier after the editing had been done when you have record of the disciples asking that question. Now, one other sign of editing or stage and composition is it seems unlikely to me that the beloved disciple would have referred to himself as such. In other words, it seems to me to be very odd to think that whoever the beloved disciple is, that he would refer to himself consistently as the disciple whom Jesus loved, while not making that kind of statement about any of the apostles. Of course, we've already seen that in chapter 11, there is a statement that Jesus loved Lazarus, but it strikes a lot of people as very presumptuous and somewhat arrogant on the part of the beloved disciple if he consistently refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, as if he didn't love the other apostles. Now, it would be very easy to understand how a close associate or a disciple of the beloved disciple, perhaps maybe even writing after or doing his editorial work after the beloved disciple has died, it's very easy to understand why someone later might refer to his revered master as such, the disciple whom Jesus loved. It's much easier to understand how that title came into the gospel as a result of the editorial activity of a later associate or disciple of the beloved disciple, rather than the beloved disciple speaking of himself in that way. Now, those are not the only evidences of stages of composition, but they're the major ones and enough to get some stuff out on the table for us. Interestingly enough, there's a couple of early traditions that do suggest, although they don't go into detail, but they do suggest that other people were involved in the composition of the fourth gospel. These are found in the Muratorian canon and also in the anti-Marcionite prologue of John. We've talked about both of these sources previously. Generally, they're dated right around the beginning of the 3rd century. So, doesn't necessarily prove anything, but it is interesting that there is seems to be some memory that's being passed down here of other people being involved in the composition of the fourth gospel. Now, that raises a question. All of this raises a question, of course, as the question as the degree to which the beloved disciple authored the fourth gospel. Did he pretty much write all of it, except perhaps those verses right at the very end? Did he do the editing of which we've seen evidences? Or is the relationship between the beloved disciple and the actual writing of the gospel a little more complicated than that? For example, some people have suggested that that the gospel, at least in its finished form, was actually worded or written by one of the beloved disciples' later associates, and that it was written on the basis of the tradition that the beloved disciple passed down, but that the beloved disciple himself didn't necessarily draft the wording of the fourth gospel. And of course, it's very difficult to know. That's the reason why there's a lot of debate about this. Now, one thing that is quite clear is that this gospel, even if others were involved, maybe even to a pretty significant extent in the production of this gospel, the gospel itself claims to be based on, in some sense, authored by the beloved disciple, and therefore to rest upon eyewitness testimony. That is clear, even though the actual degree to which the beloved disciple authored the fourth gospel is not clear. Now then, let's move on to talk about the date of composition. When was this gospel written and released to the public, as it were, the church public? First of all, let's talk about something called the terminus a quo. You may not be familiar with this Latin phrase, but in talking about the date in which a book is written, this means the earliest possible date. So when you're trying to date an ancient book like this, you want to try to see what is the earliest that it could have been written and what is the latest that it could be written. So we're going to talk about the earliest. So let's talk about how early could this gospel have been written? Well, part of the answer to this question depends upon how one interprets John chapter 21, verses 20 and 23. Might want to look at that passage just for a moment. This is the passage where Jesus is discussing matters with Peter and the beloved disciple. And so Jesus prophesies to Peter in sort of a mysterious way, that he is eventually going to be martyred. Peter then wants to know, well, what about the fate of the beloved disciple? What's going to happen to him? Jesus' response is something like this: well, if I want him to live until I come again, that's none of your business. Now, the evangelist goes on to say that Jesus did not say, as apparently some people had misunderstood, that the beloved disciple would remain alive until Jesus came again, but rather Jesus said, if I want him to remain alive, then he will remain alive. So the question here is, does this passage in the Gospel of John, does it signify or imply that the beloved disciple has died, and that raised some questions or raised some controversy, because at least some Christians believe that the beloved disciple would live until the time Jesus returned. And so therefore, if the beloved disciple died and Jesus hasn't returned yet, then that could cause a crisis on the part of those who believe that. And so it's hard to know for sure whether this passage implies the death of the beloved disciple. I mean, theoretically, one could argue that the evangelist is correcting a misunderstanding even before the death of the beloved disciple. But at any rate, a lot of people think that this does imply the death of the beloved disciple. Well, that's important because according to St. Irenaeus, late 2nd century, John, the disciple of the Lord, lived into the reign of Trajan, the Roman Emperor Trajan, whose reign began in the year 98. So, you can see how all this works. If the Gospel of John was written, finalized, we might say, after the beloved disciple died, and he died sometime after 98, then of course the gospel was not composed until sometime after 98, probably in maybe the first decade of the 2nd century. Another consideration is, according to late 2nd century tradition, and I'm thinking here specifically of Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria, the 4th gospel was the last of the canonical gospels. I assume you know what I mean by the canonical gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. According to this late 2nd century tradition, the 4th gospel was the last of the canonical gospels to be written. Now, Matthew and Luke are usually dated these days in the decade of the 80s. So if this tradition is correct, and the 4th gospel was written after all the canonical gospels, then of course that means that the Gospel of John has to be dated at the very earliest in the late 80s, perhaps even the 90s. One other consideration is that a scholar by the name of J. Lewis Martin has argued that the 4th gospel presupposes the introduction of something called the Birkat HaMinim into the synagogue liturgy. Birkat HaMinim means something like the curse on the heretics. And at some point in the synagogue worship service, there was added to the prayer, to one of the main prayers in the synagogue liturgy, there was added this particular part, which calls, which pronounces a curse against various heretics, including Christians, including followers of Jesus. Now, Martin argues that the introduction of that curse into the synagogue liturgy happened around AD 85. And if the Gospel of John presupposes that that's already happened, then obviously the Gospel of John has to be written sometime after the middle of the 8th decade. So here are three different considerations that need to be taken into account, and they all suggest that the Gospel of John was not written at the very earliest earlier than about AD 90. And if the tradition of Irenaeus is correct, and if the passage in chapter 21 does presuppose the death of the beloved disciple, then it has to be dated even later than that. So those are the considerations on terminus a quo. Now let's talk about terminus ad quem, that is the latest possible date. How late could the Gospel of John have been written? This is an interesting question because you probably don't know this, but in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there were a number of scholars who dated the Gospel of John very late, well on into the 2nd century, maybe as late as the middle of the 2nd century. However, in the 1920s, a fragment of the Gospel of John was published. This fragment is called P52. On one side and on the other side of this fragment, there are portions of John chapter 18. And the people who date Greek manuscripts, it's a very refined kind of science, based on the handwriting of the manuscript and how the letters are made, have dated this fragment in the 2nd quarter of the 2nd century. That is somewhere between 125 and 150. However, this document, P52, was discovered in Egypt, not near or in Ephesus. Now that's significant because according to late 2nd century tradition, the gospel was written in Ephesus. If that tradition is correct, then obviously the gospel has been around for a while because it has obviously been copied, and some copy wound up in Egypt by the 2nd quarter of the 2nd century. And so therefore, because of the discovery of P52, most scholars are not comfortable dating the 4th gospel much later than about 110 or so. So most contemporary scholars date the 4th gospel either at the very end of the 1st century or in the 1st decade or so of the 2nd century. So this much later dating of the Gospel of John just sort of went out the window when people had time to examine and consider the implications of this fragment P52. By the way, this fragment is the earliest fragment of any New Testament book, at least the earliest that's generally acknowledged by all scholarship. And it's in the possession of the University Library in Manchester, England. So if you're ever in Manchester and you want to go to the John Rylands Library there, then you might have an opportunity to see P52. Very famous fragment because there is no other fragment of the New Testament that is older or as old as P52, at least not one that's recognized pretty much by all scholarship. Now then, let's talk about place of composition. Where was the Gospel of John written? Well, we don't really have a whole lot of information about this. St. Irenaeus is the earliest, and he gives his testimony about 180. He's the earliest to comment on the place where the fourth gospel was composed, and he says that it was composed in Ephesus. Ephesus, of course, is on the western coast of what is today Turkey. And this tradition was repeated by numerous later patristic sources, and most of those, maybe all of them, derived their idea from the writings of Irenaeus. So we don't really have, if Ephesus is not correct for where this gospel was written, we just really don't have any way of proposing a likely spot other than Ephesus. Now, finally, let's talk about the purpose of the fourth gospel. There is a purpose statement, of course, found in John chapter 20. We've already looked at this, John chapter 20, the last two verses. And it says that these signs, signs found in the Gospel of John, were written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This whole question is complicated a little bit by the fact that in Greek, where the text says you might believe, that's actually just one word in Greek. It takes three English words for us to translate it, but it's just one word in Greek. But in the early manuscripts, some manuscripts have the word in one Greek tense, and the other manuscripts have it in a different tense. Now, some of the early manuscripts have it in a Greek tense called the aorist tense. And some of them think that this tense would signify a coming to faith. In other words, that this gospel was written in order that you might come to faith, that is, become a believer. While the present tense of the same word, according to some scholars, would signify something a little different. It would signify a growing in faith as opposed to an initial coming to faith. So this would raise questions. Is the purpose evangelistic? Is the purpose of this gospel to bring non-believers to faith? Or is this the purpose of this gospel in order to strengthen and edify the faith of people who already are believers? Several considerations here. First of all, using the science of textual criticism, it's very difficult to determine which one of these readings is the original reading. The evidence is fairly evenly balanced, and so it's very difficult to have any real assurance of which one of these readings is original. Also, tense alone really doesn't solve everything. A good example of this is found in John chapter 2, verse 11. This is a story of Jesus and his disciples at the wedding feast at Cana. Jesus already has disciples at this point. They obviously already believe in him. But we are told at the end of this story that when the disciples realize the miracle that Jesus has performed, it says they believed. Now, and this is the aorist tense, by the way. But that obviously does not mean that they believe for the first time, because they're already disciples of Jesus. So when it says when they saw this miracle, they believed, it has to mean something like their faith was confirmed. They believed even more strongly, or they were more assured in their faith. It has to mean something like that in chapter 2. Another thing to think about here is that in the first century, very few people could read and write. So, unlike today, when people can have copies of the Bible in their homes and they can read it whenever they want to, most ancient people could not read, and they didn't have the money to own a book. Books were very expensive. They had to be produced by hand, took a lot of time, and therefore they were very expensive. So most people only came into contact with the gospel when they went to a church service and heard the gospel read. That would suggest, of course, that the purpose of this gospel was oriented more toward the churches and toward people who were already believers than it would have been people who were not believers. Of course, in church services, there might from time to time have been people who were not believers, who were just coming to the assembly to see what's going on. But for the most part, the people that would have heard the Gospel of John read and been exposed to it were people who were already believers. On balance, most contemporary scholars believe that the fourth Gospel was directed more toward insiders than outsiders. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that you shouldn't use the Gospel of John in evangelism today. All we're talking about, of course, is what was the purpose that the author produced this gospel to begin with. And it seems more likely to me, although you can certainly disagree with this if you would like, but it seems more likely to me that it was intended more for the strengthening and the confirmation of faith for people who were already believers. But the Gospel of John, of course, does indicate that there was a very sharp clash between Jews, the Jews who did not believe in Jesus, and the Jews who did. And because of that, it may very well have been the case that the author of this gospel, in a situation where there's a lot of argument back and forth and a lot of controversy, may have felt that it would be very valuable to write this gospel to keep believers from wavering in the midst of this controversy, and to assure them that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, the Son of God. All right, that's all we're going to do in this lecture. In our next lecture, we'll have we'll deal with just a few more introductory matters, and then we'll be ready to get into the text. So I will see you then.